A very long time ago, before the beginning of history, people began to live along the banks of a great river. The land by the river was green and beautiful, for it was blessed with sunshine and life-giving water. The people learned how to live from the land. They learned how to raise crops and keep animals. At first, the river people lived in many different tribes, but over the years, the tribes united one with another until a great nation was formed. And in this way, 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, the Nile River gave birth to one of the most wondrous civilizations ever to grace the earth, ancient Egypt. Today, we are truly amazed by what the ancient Egyptians did 45 centuries ago. We're amazed that anyone could build these mountains of stone, perfectly laid out to the exact inch. We're amazed that anyone could carve the giant Sphinx, 66 feet tall, chiseled from solid rock, using only simple copper tools. Who were these amazing people? No one knows for sure where the ancient Egyptians came from, but we do know what they looked like and how they lived, because they left us pictures of themselves. We know that the Egyptians were small, around 5 feet tall, and that their skin was light to dark brown. We know they wore simple but beautiful clothing made of linen. Both men and women wore dark makeup around their eyes, which they applied using a narrow stick. Both men and women often shaved their heads, and they liked to wear braided wigs. Although some of their habits might seem strange to us, the ancient Egyptians were a civilized people, not too different from ourselves. Here we see a wealthy Egyptian sitting comfortably with his wife, playing a board game. Of course, not all of the people were so wealthy and well-dressed. Most were simple farmers like these modern Egyptians. They lived a life toiling in the fields and caring for their animals. Yet these people created a great civilization, with fantastic pyramids and temples, with commerce, art, and science. How did this civilization arise? To understand the roots of ancient Egypt, we must begin by looking at the river. In ancient times, the land of Egypt was called the gift of the Nile. For without this great river, Egyptian civilization would not have existed. The Nile is born deep within the African continent. It begins its journey from tropical lakes and snowy mountains, far to the south of Egypt. From there it flows 4,000 miles northward to the Mediterranean Sea. It is one of the world's biggest rivers. After plunging from the mountains, it spreads out to begin its graceful journey through Egypt. Here it passes through a timeless landscape, for life along the Nile has changed very little since the beginning of history. The river flows past fields which today are worked just as they were thousands of years ago. It flows past shepherds driving their sheep along the riverbank, and past farmers working together in the fields within sight of the silent water. Occasionally, the river glides by magnificent temples from the distant past, or past lush groves of palm trees, a reminder of the time when forests filled with flowers and wildlife cloaked much of the land along the Nile. In ancient times, water lilies grew along the riverbanks. The people living in the Nile Valley chose this beautiful flower as a symbol of their land. Yet, throughout its journey to the sea, the Nile actually flows through a vast desert called the Sahara. The Sahara extends for hundreds of miles across the north of Africa. It is difficult to travel through the Sahara. Large distances must be crossed without water, and the temperature reaches 115 degrees. The ancient Egyptians did travel here, but only when necessary. Mainly, they traveled up and down the river by boat, just as people do today. The ancient Egyptians could row or even sail downriver, aided by the river current. To return upriver, they simply filled their sails with wind, which usually blows from the north. The river carried almost everything. Even the heavy stones they used to build their temples were carried on the river in sailing ships. And at cities along the Nile, they unloaded precious cargo from foreign lands. For Egyptian sailors ventured out across the Mediterranean Sea to trade with their neighbors. Luckily for the Egyptians, the burning desert on both sides of the Nile protected the valley from invasion by foreign armies. In ancient times, this protected valley, the valley of the Upper Nile, was called Upper Egypt. In the north, the river divides and follows many different channels to the sea, forming a fan-shaped delta. The delta was called Lower Egypt. Every summer, far to the south in Africa, tropical rains and melting snow sent a flood of water down the Nile. The people in Egypt would watch the river slowly rise until it spilled out of its banks and flooded across the land. Only the hills were left above the flood. After the flood was over, the land began to dry out, but the flood water left behind a thick layer of mud or silt. This fresh soil was very fertile, just what the Egyptian farmers needed to raise their crops. The farmers let the new soil dry out for about a week, and then they began the yearly task of preparing the soil for planting. Under the warm desert sun, the land was quickly transformed into a beautiful garden with vegetables sprouting near fields of barley. As the soil continued to dry out, water was brought from the river. They used a system of canals and ditches to bring water to the fields. Of course, in a desert, water is precious, and it was considered a great evil to take water that did not belong to you. Water was shared among the people, and in a place where it almost never rains, the Egyptian people created one of the most lush and productive lands on earth. By the end of the year, as the water level in the Nile continued to drop, the land finally dried out. This was the time of harvest. Grain was cut and stored, and fodder was collected for the animals. In most years, the land produced enough food for everyone. The delta was very different from Upper Egypt, for much of it was flooded marshlands. This was the home of the sacred papyrus plant, a symbol of Lower Egypt. This delicate-looking plant helped to build Egyptian civilization, for seemingly everything was made from it. Thick mats for the floors and roofs of houses were made from the strong stems of the papyrus. Baskets and even boats were made from it. But the most important use was in making paper. The Egyptians invented a paper that they could write on. They were able to record important events, write down laws, or even write poetry. The invention of paper was a giant step on the way to modern civilization. In fact, our word paper comes from the word papyrus. As we have learned, in the very early centuries of Egyptian civilization, the people living along the Nile belonged to many different tribes, and they were divided into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. However, in about the year 3100 BC, Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt, so finally the two lands were united under one ruler, a man called Menes. Menes wore the white crown of Upper Egypt, which looked like this. After he conquered Lower Egypt, Menes also wore the red crown of Lower Egypt, which looked like this. After that time, Egyptian rulers often wore the double crown, which was a combination of both crowns and symbolized their dominion over both lands. So began the world's first nation, the first country with a government strong enough to unite thousands of people spread over hundreds of miles. After the white crown of Upper Egypt was combined with the red crown of Lower Egypt, the nation flourished for most of the next 27 centuries. The ruler was called the Pharaoh, a word which means great house. The pharaohs, such as King Khafre, seen here, had absolute power over their subjects. They were considered to be the children of gods, or even gods themselves. The Egyptians built enormous stone temples to glorify the pharaohs and the gods, such as this great temple built for Queen Hatshepsut. Only a few pharaohs were as powerful as she. This is King Ramses the Great, one of the most powerful of all the pharaohs. Soon after Ramses became pharaoh, he ordered the construction of the huge temple at Abu Simbel, carved from a sandstone cliff overlooking the Nile. Here, 4 gigantic statues of Ramses, 8 stories tall, stare out across the river. Other statues, showing some of his favorite wives and children, stand between his legs. His many wives bore him more than 90 children. The door we see leads into his great temple. Inside, several large rooms have been hollowed out from the solid rock. They too contain giant statues, and their walls are decorated with ancient Egyptian writing. In all his many statues, Ramses is made to appear large and powerful, while all those around him look small and insignificant. But one of his wives did reach a high position. She was his favorite wife, Nofretari, seen here. Ramses liked her so much, he ordered another temple built next to his and dedicated it to her. On the front of her temple, 6 giant people 30 feet tall seemed to step out of the rock cliff. Even though the temple was dedicated to Nofretari, it appears that Ramses could not miss an opportunity to have more statues made of himself. Of the 6 statues, 4 are of Ramses. Here he is, standing guard on each side of the door. The writing on the wall between the statues talks about Ramses. It says that he was chosen to be the king by one of the gods. But the statues of Nofretari also show her greatness, for they portray her as a goddess, the goddess Hathor. Hathor was just one of many gods and goddesses we find carved on temple walls throughout Egypt. Hathor always has the horns of a cow on her head, and between the horns is a round disk which represents the sun. The sun itself was a very important god, for the Egyptians knew that without the sun, life would not be possible. Here, at the ruined temple of Kom Ombo, the sun disk has been carved high on a wall facing the river. It is adorned with the wings of the sacred falcon and guarded on each side by a cobra snake. The sun god was called Re, and ordinary Egyptians called themselves the cattle of Re, while the pharaoh claimed to be his child. Most of the other gods had the heads of animals or birds because from the earliest times, certain animals and birds were sacred to the Egyptians. The falcon was sacred to the Egyptians even before the beginning of history. Then, during historic times, he was worshipped as Horus, the special protector of kings. Here we see him wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. This great temple at Edfu was dedicated to Horus, while many of the other animal gods had their own special temples. The crocodile god Sobek appears on the walls of a temple built in his honor. And in a city called Crocodilopolis, a live crocodile was kept in the temple in a special pool. We have seen that tribes of people living along the Nile River learned how to use water from the river to farm the land. At first, their land was divided into Upper and Lower Egypt. But in about 3100 BC, the two lands were united under a king called Menes. An Egyptian ruler was called a pharaoh. He was considered to be the child of a god, or even a god himself. The people worshipped Re, the sun god. They also worshipped certain birds and animals as gods. That was thousands of years ago. So how do we know so many things about the ancient Egyptians? How do we know, for example, that a live crocodile was kept in the temple pool at Crocodilopolis? We know these things because it was all written down. The ancient Egyptians had a language which they wrote using little pictures. Writing using pictures is called hieroglyphic writing. These are a few of the pictures used in hieroglyphic writing. For example, here we see a little picture of the sun. This is water, and this is a piece of cloth which has been folded. They also used a goose, the leaf of a marsh plant, a shape like a mouth, and the strap from a sandal. Some of the pictures meant exactly what you might think. For example, this picture of an eye with tears meant to cry. This bee meant bee or honey, while these wavy hills meant hill country. But most of the pictures were actually used to represent sounds, just like the letters of our alphabet. For example, a mouth represented the sound R, like our letter R, while the water symbol stood for a sound like our letter N. A mouth plus water spelled a word, the word name. Finally, some of the pictures represented more than one letter or sound. For example, the goose stood for two sounds, S and A, and sounded something like sa. The sandal strap had an even longer sound. The word for sandal strap sounded something like ANKH or ANK. When sounds like these were put together, they could make longer words or even parts of sentences. For example, a folded cloth plus a sandal strap meant causes to live. Now when we see ancient Egyptian writing, we can recognize some of the pictures. This oval frame is called a cartouche. Names of important people were always placed inside of cartouches. These two cartouches contain the royal names of Ramesses the Great. And remember the sandal strap, the ankh? We find it everywhere on temple walls. It had a special meaning to the Egyptians, for the ankh was the symbol for life. The ancient Egyptians believed that the sun, after traveling across the heavens, went down in the west to begin a nightly journey through the underworld. They believed that after a person died, their body should be buried on the west side of the river. Then their soul might enter the underworld and live with the gods. So it became customary to bury the bodies of the dead on the west side of the Nile, in the searing desert beyond the river. At first the bodies were simply buried. The desert sand dried the body and preserved it. Jars of food were placed in the grave so that the soul, known as the Ka, would not be hungry in the afterlife. After a time, the Egyptians began to treat the body in ways to preserve it better. They wrapped the body and soaked it in natural chemicals. A body which has been preserved is called a mummy. This mummy still has hair and skin. It was very important to preserve the body after death, because the Ka needed a body to live in. Sometimes the mummies of kings and the most wealthy Egyptians were buried under stone monuments like this one. This building is called a mastaba. Mastaba means bench because it looks like a flat bench with sloped sides. Buried in the ground under the mastaba was a tomb, a burial chamber to hold the mummy. But one pharaoh was not satisfied to be buried under a simple mastaba. The powerful King Zoser ordered that a great stack of mastabas be placed, one on top of another, until they formed a huge pyramid. The result was a mammoth structure that dwarfed all others. It stood 200 feet tall. This was the first pyramid ever built, and it started a building revolution in ancient Egypt. Over the next 800 years, at least 80 pyramids were built in Egypt, beautiful monuments of smooth stone rising evenly to a point. Some of these pyramids are among the biggest structures ever built anywhere in the world. It took thousands of workers many years to build them. The largest, when complete, was 481 feet tall. Enormous stone blocks were used. They had to be cut out of the ground by hand, shaped perfectly square, and dragged to the site. Each block weighs about 2.5 tons, and each pyramid contains more than 2 million of these blocks. A pyramid would have a hidden door. From here, a secret tunnel would lead to the burial chamber. Besides the mummy, the burial chamber would hold the treasures of the pharaoh. The coffin might be covered with pure gold. Riches almost beyond description filled the burial rooms. But we will never know exactly what was left in the pharaoh's tombs, because almost all of them were broken into thousands of years ago, and the robbers stole everything. Eventually, the pharaohs abandoned the practice of building pyramids. They were terribly difficult to make, and in the end, they were not even safe against robbers. In later centuries, the pharaohs were buried farther up the Nile, in the desert, beyond the river. Here, in the Valley of the Kings, are the hidden tombs of many powerful pharaohs, like Ramses the Great. It is hard to tell that under these mountains are dozens of secret tunnels and royal burial chambers, for all the doors were hidden. But as with the pyramids, all of the doors were found and the tombs were robbed, except one tomb, the lost tomb of King Tutankhamun. This golden mask was found covering the face of the mummy when the tomb was finally discovered in 1922. Mystery still surrounds this pharaoh, whom we usually call King Tut. We know that he took the throne when he was only about 10 years old. He married a girl of 12, and he died when he was about 19. This gold-covered lion was among hundreds of beautiful items discovered in his tomb, as was this cedarwood chest inlaid with ivory. Even his gold-covered throne was found. On the backrest, we see the king attended by his young wife, Ankhesenamun. These and other treasures show us the beauty, wealth, and grandeur of ancient Egypt. The magnificent civilization of ancient Egypt would not last forever. After living together by the river for more than 2,000 years, the Egyptian nation began to come apart. Beginning around 1100 BC, wars broke out between different princes wanting to rule the country. The pharaoh could not control them, and even foreign armies marched against Egypt. Then, in 332 BC, Egypt was conquered by this man, Alexander the Great, the famous Greek warrior king. Greece had a culture as rich and deeply rooted as that of Egypt, and Alexander brought that culture to the Nile Valley. Greek pharaohs ruled Egypt until 30 BC, when it became a province of the Roman Empire. When the Romans entered Egypt, the pyramids were already 25 centuries old. Even then, this land was cloaked in antiquity and mystery. The pharaohs passed into history, but the land and the people remain, living almost unchanged for 5,000 years. Their sacred river, as it always has, glides silently past them to the sea.